Just a note before we begin, this is an emergency podcast, and as a result of some of the excitement, adult language is used in this episode. We didn't bleep it out. It's there for you, so if you have children or somebody else who doesn't want to hear swear words, we wanted to let you know. All right, enjoy. Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. This is an emergency podcast. Justice Anthony Kennedy announced today that he is retiring from the Supreme Court. It's big news, and there's plenty to talk about. Who will Trump nominate? How will votes in the Senate break down? To what extent does this change the court? And of course, how is this going to affect the midterms as well? So here with me to discuss all of it are Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver. Hey, Nate, how's it going?
Great. How are you, Galen?
Doing well. And we also have 538 contributor who covers the Supreme Court, Amelia Thompson DeVoe. She's on the line. Thank you for joining us, Amelia.
Of course. It's a big day.
I know you are also on deadline right now, so we're going to use your time efficiently. Out of the gates, where are your heads at? Nate, how big of a deal is this?
I mean, it's a big fucking deal. I guess we can't swear, right? Like,
I mean, I can edit it out, or we can leave it in and make like a note saying that this is not suitable for children.
I think this is an appropriate moment to swear, personally.
Yeah. If I have 3 big fucking deals a year, then I think this would be, I would use one of my big fucking deals on this.
Okay, all right. So maybe that gives us some sense of where your head is at. But, okay, why is this such a big fucking deal, if you will?
I mean, because the Supreme Court is one of 3 supposedly co-equal branches of government, and this guy is the swing vote on the Supreme Court. I mean, yeah.
All right.
I mean, come on, dude.
In a nutshell.
Everything from abortion to gerrymandering to, you know, cake baking or whatever else could be influenced for many, many years and decades to come by this announcement today.
All right, Amelia, get in here. Are you surprised? Where's your head at?
I'm surprised at the way it happened. There has been conversation for the past couple of years that Anthony Kennedy might be thinking about retiring. He's quite old. He's the second oldest justice on the Supreme Court right now. He's 81. He's been on the court for more than 30 years. So there was discussion after Trump won the 2016 election that Kennedy might think about leaving. There was a kind of flurry of Kennedy retirement rumors last year, didn't end up happening. So a lot of people were thinking that he might announce his retirement from the bench this morning, along with the last 2 opinions for this year's Supreme Court term, and he didn't. And so when they adjourned without announcing that anyone had retired, because there had also been a little bit of speculation that Justice Clarence Thomas might be leaving, I certainly thought, I think a lot of other people also thought, that this was it, and we were going to have at least one more year with Kennedy. And so it was pretty surprising to see that he had written this letter later in the day and announced that he was retiring, which of course he's allowed to do. Justices can announce their retirement in whatever way they want, and other justices have announced it in this way. So I'm surprised by that. On the other hand, this is not incredibly surprising if you sort of look at the pattern of how Supreme Court justices have retired in the past. Kennedy was appointed by Ronald Reagan. As I mentioned, he's quite old. He's been on the support for a really long time. And there's this convention that I wrote about for 538 a few months ago that a lot of justices like to retire under a president who's from the same party as the president who appointed them. So in some sense, it makes perfect sense that Kennedy, who was appointed by a Republican, he is a Republican, would want to retire under a Republican president and Republican Congress. But Kennedy is also a pretty unusual justice. So I think a lot of people weren't sure how this was going to shake out. And I'm certainly very surprised. I think a lot of other people are, too.
President Trump has obviously already nominated one judge to the Supreme Court. How different is this from replacing Justice Antonin Scalia?
It's different in the sense that you're replacing a relatively moderate, although people would debate whether, you know, where on the spectrum Kennedy is between moderate and conservative, but you're not replacing Scalia, right? You're replacing a relatively moderate justice, and Republicans had an argument last time that it's 1 for 1, you swap like for like, And so we aren't really altering anything by not having allowed Merrick Garland to be voted upon in 2016. If Trump is nominating this time a right-wing conservative, then that would change the composition of the court, and I assume they would lean into that argument and say, conservatives, here's your reward. Here's why you voted for me despite all the doubts you had. I mean, I guess we don't know, what Trump will do. If you nominate someone who's really conservative, then I suppose you have some risk from the Murkowskis and the Collinses. Would they fold at the end of the day? Probably is my guess. But they only have a margin of 2. There are scenarios where, because we have to talk about the math here, there are scenarios where John McCain or some other senator gets sick, and then maybe you only have a margin of 1. So you don't have that much wiggle room. Democrats did win 1 seat last December when Doug Jones won. You could nominate a moderate that would maybe not have the benefit of pleasing his base as much. It could put some swing state Democrats in a tough spot. There are 5 Democratic senators from states that Trump won, I think, by large margins. So North Dakota, Indiana, West Virginia, so on and so forth. Missouri with Claire McCaskill, I'm forgetting one. Montana is the 5th. He could nominate someone who, regardless of their ideology, has vetting problems. Trump has mostly avoided having nominations that went totally off the rails, and there were names that were withdrawn, but that happens now and then.
That's the reason Kennedy got on the court in the first place. He was the second choice after Robert Bork. So it would be pretty funny if there was a kind of similar knockdown, drag-out fight to replace him 30 years later.
Amelia, do we have any idea who Trump is considering?
Yeah, so we have a pretty good idea because Trump has had this list for a while of judges and other people that he would consider appointing to replace any justice who would leave or pass away while on the court. And I believe he's repeated within the past couple hours that he's going to be picking someone from that list. And one of the things about the Trump presidency that I think we have, all noticed and paid attention to is that it's very unpredictable. But when it comes to his judicial nominations, there's been a lot of control, and he's been getting a lot of advice from organizations like the Federalist Society, which is a conservative legal organization that is very powerful, and the Heritage Foundation. So, if you think about vetting problems, I think it's less likely that there will be issues like we've seen for some of Trump's cabinet appointees where, sort of stuff has come out that it seems like a kind of basic background check would have turned up. But they run the gamut a little bit, but they're all quite conservative. And I think, pretty much anyone that we would see being appointed would be to the right of Kennedy and might actually not be the median on the court anymore. It might put John Roberts in the position of being the court's median justice, which would be really interesting.
So let's talk about how that shakes up the court. Assuming, for a moment that President Trump nominates a hardline conservative, how does that change the makeup of the court? And how does that change what kind of decisions we can expect from the court?
It's funny because Kennedy has been the median on the court for a really long time, ever since Sandra Day O'Connor left in 2005, and he had sort of been sharing that swing vote status with her. But he's actually quite conservative on a number of key issues. I think, there's going to be a lot written about his legacy, and I just want to stress that this is the justice who wrote the decision in Citizens United. So on certain issues, I think we're not going to see much of a change from a Trump appointee, sort of compared to Kennedy. But on issues like gay rights and to a lesser extent abortion, and also issues, potentially like gerrymandering, and also the death penalty and criminal justice issues, we can probably expect one of these more sort of mainstream conservative replacements to be to the right of Kennedy. And so I think that, it does a couple things. I think it sort of puts in doubt the future of some important Supreme Court precedents because now there's a solid conservative majority to think about, potentially overturning or chipping away at something like Roe versus Wade. And it also puts John Roberts potentially as the median justice. And that's interesting, too, because as the Chief Justice, he has concerns about the court's institutional credibility. And so, if he becomes the swing vote, then we might see some moderating influence, not because John Roberts is necessarily moderate, but because he doesn't, he might not want his court to go down in history as the court that overturned Roe versus Wade, for example. So I think it's going to be interesting, and it's not totally clear what would happen because of that.
Nate, I know you're not a court watcher, but are there particular issues that you have your eye on in terms of how they'll play out in a new court that is potentially more conservative?
I mean, because we cover elections, issues like gerrymandering are potentially quite interesting, and also issues about like voting rights and voting access. I think there's a sense that it's not just about conservative versus liberal, but that Supreme Court justices nowadays are also partisans and vote the party line. I mean, there are kind of two definitions of moderate, right? There's like kind of politically in the center is one. There's like kind of temperamentally moderate is number two. And then kind of a third is like kind of moderate in the sense of like a Burkean conservative who doesn't want to overturn too much precedent and custom and tradition, I suppose. And so maybe Roberts is more moderate in those other two senses than the first sense, but you do have a lot of judges who are basically partisans, and that goes back to the decision in Gore versus Bush and everything else, right? Which I know, they all voted along party lines. None of them, I don't think, had any real, judicial argument to make there, right? They were just saying, okay, well, when push comes to shove, we're voting with the president we prefer to have elected. And so the court's both more partisan and more conservative than it used to be.
And I'll say here that if you've been following our coverage of gerrymandering, you know that a lot of the legal arguments surrounding partisan gerrymandering have been based off of things that Anthony Kennedy has said about the issue. And so I think this is a pretty big blow to lawyers who are trying to reform partisan gerrymandering through the courts. I think it's less likely at this point that we will see a ruling out of the Supreme Court saying that partisan gerrymandering can be unconstitutional. But I think also people definitely have their eyes on the issue of Roe v. Wade. Amelia, do we know what kind of cases we could expect to be brought to a more conservative court, or how it might change compared to the court when Kennedy sat on it?
I think there are kind of two paths for the court to go down, and the pro-life movement has kind of been preparing for both of them. Over the past 7 or 8 years, there have just been a slew of state-level restrictions on abortion, and they have gotten more and more restrictive. So they've sort of gone from kind of trying to chip away at the edges of Roe versus Wade to challenging it outright. And one of the most recent of these was a law in Iowa that banned abortion once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which is around 6 weeks into a pregnancy. So at that point, many women wouldn't even know that they're pregnant. And it's also a direct challenge to Roe in a way that some of these other laws haven't been. And so, the court doesn't like to overturn past precedents, and Roe is one that is, if they were to overturn it, it would just be kind of a political bomb. And so, they did just overturn past precedent today, actually, in a case about union fees, a precedent from 1977. So it's not like they don't do it. But they could take a case like this Iowa law that challenges Roe and use it as an opportunity to just say, okay, we're going to ban all or most abortions in the U.S. We're going to overturn Roe. Or they could sort of kill Roe with 1,000 cuts, which is something else that legal experts have been predicting for a while, which is essentially that they can, not overturn it outright, but they can start allowing a lot of these state restrictions that are currently being litigated. And, that's things like waiting periods and these restrictions that make it very difficult for abortion clinics to stay open or for abortion doctors to practice in abortion clinics and other hospitals. And by allowing these smaller restrictions, they make it more difficult for people to access abortion, and they sort of set up a future in which a court 10 or 20 years from now could say, you know, we know that Roe versus Wade is this really important precedent, but we have all these cases that kind of undermine it. And, you know, Roe is functionally dead because of this string of cases. And so that's an outcome that someone like John Roberts might prefer if he doesn't want his court to go down in history as being the court that overturned Roe versus Wade. But there are obviously people in the pro-life legal movement, which is extremely well organized and has been sort of planning for this moment for a long time, that would like to see a challenge to Roe outright. So I think it's a little hard to predict, but it does seem likely that we'll see one of those paths unfolding.
And I think we'll continue following that. And of course, that is a very political issue as well. And I think that Kennedy's retirement in general is likely to become, or is already, a political issue. So Nate, how do you expect this to affect the midterms at this point?
I mean, it depends on which of these paths that Trump takes. Is it a moderate? Is it conservative? Is it a smooth process? Is it get screwed up and delayed? Do they dare tempt fate and the idea of what if something gets a little screwed up and we decide we're probably going to hold the Senate anyway, we'll motivate our voters, and maybe we will push it into next year? I mean, there are a lot of variables here.
So hold off and don't have a vote now and say, hey, voters, show us that you really want us.
Pretty unlikely. Okay. But I do think some of the people who I'm following on Twitter, this is all pretty instant reaction, who are very, I guess it's 538, is very kind of thinking about political logistics. Some of them will say, okay, if you don't really care about what actually happens, then it's a big gamble where the upside is that now it's an open seat and you motivate your voters, right? And even though the GOP is a heavy favorite to lose seats in the House, maybe not the House overall, the Senate, there are quite a few places where they could gain seats and that could yield a more robust majority, you know, and I mean, we'll see. There's a lot of balls in the air here still. You know, obviously the two big factors are, number one, what effect does it have on these various senators? Most of whom are Democrats who have tough votes. If you're Heidi Heitkamp, North Dakota senator, right? On the one hand, it's like, oh my gosh, now I have to, you know, vote against a Trump nominee right in the middle of an election season when I'm running ads saying how I support the president 60% of the time. No, you don't. You can just vote for Trump's nominee, right? That will piss off the left. Who cares? If you're Heidi Heitkamp, then number one, there's not much of a left in North Dakota. And number two, you don't face a primary challenge now for 5.5 years. So some of the red state Democrats might say, okay, great, right? I'm not a swing vote anyway. You're going to get 51 Republicans or 50 with Pence being the tiebreaker. So my vote isn't decisive anyway. I'll go ahead and vote with the majority here to prove how bipartisan I am. I'm in a really red state. So who cares, you know? Dean Heller in Nevada is the one Republican kind of in a similar spot. Remember, Jeff Flake in Arizona was vulnerable, but he's retiring. Although that's a different type of risk to Trump, where if it's someone who they thought was wishy-washy, Jeff Flake's very conservative on court issues, right? But someone who they thought was wishy-washy on limits to constitutional power, then Flake or Rand Paul or someone could potentially cause issues, I suppose. You know, puts Dean Heller in a somewhat difficult spot. It potentially excites both bases. I think there is some thought that Republicans get more jazzed up about court issues than Democrats. On the other hand, if Democrats feel like kind of an injustice has been done with Gorsuch, you know, I mean, it takes other issues off the table. It will mean less emphasis on immigration, means less emphasis on the economy, on everything else, maybe a little bit less on Russia. And so depending on how those issues play out, you can decide, is this conversation better or worse for the parties? You know, it puts pressure on Trump to nominate someone who doesn't cause unnecessary controversy. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a wash. I don't think at all. I think it's like it could have a very large effect. I think effect's a little bit uncertain. I think the fact that you have more vulnerable Republican or fewer vulnerable Republican senators and Democratic ones might mean they're feeling a little bit better about it. But it's going to motivate a lot of Democrats, too.
Yeah, Amelia, as we wrap up, I think the conventional wisdom is that judge appointments motivate the right, specifically the religious right. Do you understand that to be true? Do you feel like the left could get motivated about it in this cycle?
So the religious right absolutely gets motivated by this. And, I think that there had been a little bit of speculation last week because of the family separation crisis that white evangelicals, who are sort of the bedrock of the religious right, might leave Trump because of their because the family separation policy was troubling to them. And I think that the Supreme Court decisions we've seen under Gorsuch, there was an abortion case yesterday that, went the way that evangelicals would want to see it, a case having to do with crisis pregnancy centers. There have been a few other cases, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, that have gone the way they want them to. And so I think the prospect of being able to seal that 5-justice conservative majority on the court would be incredibly motivating to evangelicals. And even if the seat isn't open, I think there is also a sense that, regardless of what else Trump has done, regardless of how imperfect he is, he has really delivered on these issues that really matter, especially issues like abortion. If it seems like because of Trump's nominees, Roe v. Wade might be going away, that's a huge deal. So I think certainly for them, this is enormous. For the left, I have less of a sense of how motivating this is going to be. I think in part because there aren't sort of these few core issues that are really affected by the court that the left coalesces around. And, this is something that you'd be able to speak to more, Nate, I'm sure, but I think we'll just have to see how successful the Democrats and progressives are at kind of motivating outrage over Gorsuch and Merrick Garland. And I think it'll also depend on exactly what kind of person gets nominated to fill this seat.
I mean, is a weird analogy that a few listeners probably will be annoyed by, right? There's a little bit of the issue that Democrats have with their messaging about climate change and environmental regulation. The issue being that whenever a proposal comes up, a Paris Accord or a cap and trade bill comes up, right, they have to say, pass this policy or else we're fucked, right? And then the policy doesn't pass or gets rescinded or whatever else. And they have to say, okay, this next policy, pass this policy or else we're fucked, right? We weren't actually fucked last time. We were on the pathway to being more fucked, but now we're really fucked. So it's a little bit the same, right? They are going to say, man, this is really awful, and unless somehow Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, plus all these red state Democrats, stand up and block this nomination, then America is fucked, is what Democrats will say, right, in September. Then in October, after whoever Trump nominates passes the Senate, 53 to 47, whatever it is, right, they'll say, don't let him pick another justice because then we're really fucked. Right, so it's a little bit like they have to pick their poison a little bit. I mean, certainly it is possible that, like, on some issues, Roberts will be a swing vote and maybe not that different than Kennedy. Maybe this new justice will be a little bit more of a wild card. On a small handful of issues, Gorsuch is maybe not as conservative as Scalia was, right? If, however, you were to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Clarence Thomas Part 2, that would be really, really, really consequential. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, although I guess in okay health, just kind of actuarially, like she's not necessarily someone who you would assume wouldn't retire or pass away.
I mean, a lot of people are mad she didn't retire in 2014.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I mean, Democrats will have like leverage and say, okay, you're gonna let Republican senators have 2 more years here. I mean, it's a weird message, but I'm not sure. It's not like, I guess I'm just like kind of so suspicious of the conventional wisdom that like the notion that like, oh, it's a Republican issue. I'm not sure that I just am so contrarian about this stuff. I'm not sure how much value I place in that. I do think that there will be a lot of rhetoric about Roe v. Wade that may not appeal as much to a younger generation of voters, but Roe v. Wade is, I believe, fairly popular, that precedent, as opposed to like if you frame questions as pro-choice versus pro-life. So if Democrats say vote because Roe v. Wade is at risk, I mean, the other complication is like Democratic voters are probably fairly motivated already, and maybe Republicans ones aren't as much. And so therefore, if you're like a baby boomer Democrat, you already have like 58 reasons to vote in the midterm.
And so now it's potentially giving more reasons to Republicans. All right, well, There are plenty of unknowns, and we'll have plenty more to talk about as this story moves forward, and we'll also be writing about it on the website. Amelia, I know that you have to get back to writing right now, so we will let you go. Amelia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, great to be here.
And Nate, thanks a lot as well.
Thank you.
I'm Galen Druk, and I'll mention that we actually already recorded another emergency podcast today about the upset in New York's 14th District last night. A young Democratic Socialist upset a 10-term incumbent and the number 4 Democrat in the House. So maybe we'll publish that later this week, or it could be some secret never released podcast. We'll see, but maybe keep your eyes out for that. Until then, thanks for listening.